All right, let's prep an adventure. Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. There's going to be a contest at the end of this video. I'll put a timestamp in the doobly-doo. Do not bother commenting. Commenting does not enter you into anything. Obviously, you can comment if you want to say something about the prepping an adventure video, but we're getting close to 100,000 followers, and so I thought it would be fun to do another giveaway. In the meantime, we're going to talk about prepping against the cult of the reptile god. I picked that adventure as our example because it's one I know pretty well, and I think it's a great starting adventure because it's got a cool mystery, and it's also giving me a chance, following up on the verbs video. Against the Cult of the Reptile God is one of those adventures that I think doesn't have a good verb in it, and so you're going to see how I fix that. So we'll talk about how you hook the players and what I do, and it's a pretty straightforward process. Like an adventure like Against the Cult of the Reptile God, which is only about 27, 28 pages, I would probably only spend an hour or two prepping because, and this is why I hope this is going to be a short video, I only do enough prep for the first session. I don't prep the entire adventure, and that's the first lesson, I guess, is that it's super unusual that I will read the entire adventure from cover to cover. And I've bought a lot of adventures that explicitly say you need to do that. Like, step 1, read this entire adventure from cover to cover. I don't know that I've ever done that. Just because it's actually kind of antithetical to the reason I run adventures. I run adventures, and I know a lot of people don't. I know a lot of people, in fact, think it's virtuous to roll your own and build your own adventures. I don't think one way is better than the other. Obviously, if you create your own adventure, then you know it like the back of your hand. You don't have to read anything. But that's a lot of work for me, and especially because I'm not a cartographer, I don't want to sit there drawing maps and stuff like that. It's much more easy for me to buy an adventure and just skim through it, spend a couple of hours getting enough prepped to run the first session, and then I just continually, every week, I just read a little bit more, make some more notes, and I'm always just trying to prep the next chunk of content. So that's the first secret, is you don't need to read the entire adventure. You only need to read enough to know what's going on. And even though that seems like a cheat, even though there'll be people who will be like, you can't do that, I almost always end up prepping even more than I need. I prep this much thinking, okay, now this is enough for one night, and the players only get this far. So I end up with a couple of weeks prepped ahead of time, even though I only spent a couple hours getting ready. With an adventure like Against the Cult of the Reptile God, typically the first thing I do is I read the front cover, the back cover, because I'm trying to find two critical pieces of information. The first is, what is this adventure about? And you'd be surprised at how often it is difficult to find that out just by reading the adventure starting at page 1. Often it's more useful to look at the front or back cover because that's where there's this great synopsis. And the synopsis explains everything that you're going to see in the adventure. In fact, let's zoom in on this cover and see what it says. Terror by night. The village of Orlane is dying. Once a small and thriving community, Orlane has become a maze of locked doors and frightened faces. Strangers are shunned. Trade has withered. Rumors flourish, growing wilder with each retelling. Terrified peasants flee their homes, abandoning their farms with no explanation. Others simply disappear. No one seems to know the cause of the decay. Why are there no clues? Who skulks through the twisted shadows of the night? Who or what is behind the doom that has overtaken the village? It will take a brave and skillful band of adventurers to solve the dark riddle of Orlane. Okay, I get it. There's a mystery of some sort in the town of Orlane. And again, this is one of the reasons I picked this, because we're going to talk about how to improve the verbs that the adventure gives you. The other thing the front cover tells me that is useful for figuring out whether or not I want to use this or not, whether or not there's any point in continuing to read further, is what level is it for? And this says it's for 4 to 7 adventurers of 1st to 3rd level, which means it's a low-level adventure. If my players were 5th or 7th level, I probably wouldn't even read any further. I'd say, okay, I'll come back to this later when I'm starting a new campaign. The next thing I want to do is I want to figure out how long is this adventure? Literally, what is the page count? Because that tells me a lot about how long it's going to take to run, how long it's going to take to read, and also what level are the players going to come out the other side of it. Obviously, the longer the adventure is, the higher level they will be when they finish it. And I find that most adventures fall into one of 3 categories. Either they're very short, literally on the order of 2 to 12 pages long, and that would be a Dungeon Magazine adventure. I don't think they still have Dungeon Magazine, but they used to, and there's a huge backlog. If you're looking for adventures, there's a huge backlog for years, decades. They published a magazine called Dungeon Magazine, and it would literally have 3 to 5 adventures in it. So most adventures are either really short, or they're about 28 to 32 pages, or they're like 128 pages. And so that's, it's going to take 1 or 2 nights, it's going to take 2 or 3 months, or it's going to take a year and a half. So we know how long it is. We have a vague idea of what's going on in this adventure. We know what level it's for. It's time to actually start taking it apart and seeing what is useful. And for that, here's my next trick. I do not start reading the adventure at the beginning. I start at the back. And the reason I start at the back is just because I want to know, who is the bad guy? Typically, starting from the back and reading backwards in order to find out who is the bad guy is the fastest way to figure out what's going on in this adventure. Who is the bad guy and what do they want? This information is often not at the very front of the adventure. Typically, at the very front of the adventure is all this backstory about the world or the town or the characters. And I find a lot of that stuff, a lot of authors, this is not just true of adventure authors, it's true of all writers everywhere, think that in order for you, the consumer, to appreciate their brilliance, you have to know everything they knew when they were creating the work. And that is nonsense. So I want to know, who are the players going to fight? Who is the bad guy and what do they want? What are they trying to do? So I start at the back and I read backwards. And if you do that with Against the Cult of the Reptile God, you only go 2 or 3 pages before you find Explicitica de Phyllis, who is the bad guy of the adventure, that tells you who she is and what she wants. It turns out she's a spirit naga. And if you go into the monster manual, a spirit naga is like a 9th level bad guy or something like that. So obviously I'm going to have to do a little bit of work and level down Explicitica de Phyllis and make her, I'm going to keep her a spirit naga. She's not going to have as many hit points. She's going to be a little bit easier to hit. Her abilities are going to stay the same. They're just not as likely to work because they're going to be tuned for a first, or probably by the time they get to her, a 3rd level party. But I've just got that in the back of my head. I could actually do that on the fly when the players actually get there. I'm not going to do any work to fix Explicitica de Phyllis, the bad guy. And this gets to another reason why I like buying and using adventures, because if you go through Against the Cult of the Reptile God, you get to fight this famous monster from Dungeons & Dragons. If you look in the monster manual, there's a quote from Explicitica de Phyllis in the Naga section. So I like running classic adventures because it gives this feeling that we're all in a shared world together, that we're all experiencing playing D&D together, and it gives the players this communal language to talk about their experience. So we haven't really done much work yet. This is probably only about 10 or 15 minutes of reading, and we already know, we already have a vague idea of what's going on in the adventure. It's about a town and a curse, and we know that somewhere out there, we don't know exactly where, is a spirit naga who's responsible for all of it. So now we start at the front and start reading forward. And not unusually, we get a whole bunch of text at the front of Against the Cult of the Reptile God about what is D&D, how to read these stats, none of which I need. And then we have the history of the area, which I don't need, especially because I don't run Greyhawk, which is where this was originally set. So I skip a lot of stuff. I remember Elmore Leonard, one of the best pieces of advice I ever read on writing was when somebody asked Elmore Leonard why his stuff was so punchy and so much easier to read than all the other stuff they read. Leonard said, "I don't write the stuff people tend to skip." And that resonated with me because when I'm reading a novel, I often skip stuff. If I see that there's pages and pages of no dialogue and no action, I get bored. I did this especially when I was a teenager. I do it less now. But that notion that you have to read the entire adventure in order to understand it, it's just not true. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons it's not as onerous a task for me to run an adventure. If you're one of those people, if you're a completist, if you feel like I have to read everything, then yeah, I can understand why running an adventure would kind of be a pain in the butt. But I'm here to give you permission not to do that. Remember that if it turns out you get to a point in the adventure where you're confused, the adventure is referencing stuff you don't understand, you can always go back and read the stuff you skipped. The answer might be in there. And I have found every once in a while, I'd say maybe like 10 or 15% of the time, there is an answer, something important that I skipped in a section, but I can just go back and read it again. It's not a big deal. So we have the introduction, we skip that. We have the DM background, we skip that. And now we're on to notes for the DM. These are bad header titles, by the way, because none of those 3 header titles really gives me an idea of what I'm about to read. But the notes for the DM, which is at the end of the first page and after several hundred words, the notes for the DM is the first point in Against the Cult of the Reptile God where they really start spelling out what is going to happen. And they explain that you're going to spend the first third of the adventure in this town or lane, exploring, investigating, talking to townsfolk, trying to figure out what's going on. You're going to eventually discover that there's a cult to this reptile god, Explicitica de Phyllis, in the swamp. And the second part of the adventure is getting to the swamp. And the third part of the adventure is a 2-level dungeon in the swamp. And at that point, I feel like I have a pretty good idea what's going on in this adventure. And again, we haven't done much work yet. Moving forward, we discover there's a key to the town. We have a map of the town and all the buildings in it are labeled. And here are the descriptions for those labels. It's all the townsfolk. And again, this is an old school adventure where they're expecting any thieves in the party to be practicing pickpockets and stuff like that. So all of the villagers all have all of their cash detailed here. I don't need that information, but I'm going to go through this section. I'm going to read, I'm not going to read every single entry. I'm just going to skim it and I'm going to see which of these NPCs are useful to me. Which are the players likely to want to go talk to? Who are the movers and shakers in town? For instance, there's like a carpenter and a moneylender, and they're described in here, but I don't think the players are likely to go talk to them. So I'm not going to make any notes on that section since this is all written down anyway. If the players later on during the course of the adventure, while we're playing, decide they want to go talk to the money lender, like for instance, they got some gems from the dungeon or whatever, and they want to exchange it for gold, that's fine. That's when I will read this section. I'll do it at the table. There's plenty of time to read the adventure at the table because your players are often going to be spending time arguing and debating what to do. So at this point, I actually start making notes. I create a Word document and I start writing it, and you can look at that Word document. There's a link in the doobly-doo, and this is literally what my notes look like. This is not something I tailored for anybody but me. And you can see I called out some of the townsfolk, not all of them, the ones I thought that were important. And in some cases, I renamed them because I didn't like the names in the adventure. That's probably what I spend most of my time doing, by the way, when I'm prepping an adventure, is just renaming things so that they fit my world. You can see in my notes that I only pick a handful of townsfolk and flesh them out and make notes on them because I think that's all I'm going to need. Specifically, I grabbed one farmer, the first farmer on the list, Farmer Hewitt, and I wrote about him and his family. I gave names to his wife and his kids, and I wrote about his attitude and what he thinks. And for me, and this is maybe an important point, for me, the act of writing something down fixes it in my mind so that usually I don't need to refer to it later. I just look at I print my notes out and I glance at them and I refresh my memory. I'm not literally reading my notes, and I try to avoid giving speeches in my notes. I do it every once in a while, but I try to avoid dialogue in my notes. I'll prefer to use bullet points because if I have it all spelled out, then I feel like I have to read it. I have to stop talking to the players and read what it says in my notes to them. And it's more fun to role play things dramatically. So I tend to avoid keeping track of dialogue. It takes me probably about 45 minutes to an hour to go through all the characters in Orlane and pick out the ones that I think are going to be useful. For instance, the mayor is going to be useful to me. The bad guy, I rename him and call him Dalgleish, is going to be useful to me. I mentioned Farmer Hewitt. There's also a couple of different inns in town. There's a good guy inn and the bad guy inn. There's a lot of cool stuff that can happen at the bad guy inn. So I make sure that the players are going to find out about the bad guy inn first. And then if things go wrong there, they'll find out about the good guy inn because I don't want them to go to safety first. I want that to be a refuge. I want them to get in danger first. Somewhere in this process, I don't know exactly where, typically toward the front of it, as I'm reading this key to Orlane, I start annotating the map, right? The adventure, the PDF comes with a map. It's split across 2 pages. So I bring it into Photoshop. I use Photoshop all the time for this stuff, by the way. I go kind of crazy sometimes. I bring it into Photoshop. I clean it up. I make it one map, and then I shrink it down in Photoshop. I do this all the time. I shrink it down in Photoshop. I move the image around because I'm going to make notes around the outside. I do the same thing with the dungeon, the map of the dungeon. And in fact, with the map of the dungeon, what I will often do is I'll take it into Photoshop and I'll invert it. Instead of black on white, I'll make it white on black because that way the actual rooms in the dungeon are black and everything else is white. Now I've got white space I can use to make notes in. So wherever possible, and this is another piece of advice that hopefully is useful, wherever possible, I am able to run the adventure from the map, right? I shrink the map down so that I can annotate it. And here you can see, and you can download this in the doobly-doo, here you can see the annotated map. And this actually is just the beginning. I'll probably make a lot more notes on this thing. Probably after I print it out. But what you can see I've done is I've taken the key that they put in the adventure listing where everyone in the town lives, and I've printed it on the map so that when I print this out, I don't have to go back and forth between the map I give the players and the adventure. I know who lives where. And another thing is this adventure is about how several people in town are now cultists of the reptile god. They've been mind controlled by Explicita Godophilis. So I noted that in the key. When you look at the key, you can see which members of the town are now cultists, which townsfolk are now possessed by Explicita Godophilis. This is such a useful tool for me. It's one of the things that makes running an adventure relatively easy and straightforward. Now I have a key to the adventure. I can make notes on it. It sometimes feels, I will admit, while I'm at the table, like I've got a whole bunch of stuff printed out. I've got the adventure printed out, and keep in mind that I have a PDF of Against the Cult of the Reptile God, and I probably won't print out the entire thing for the first session. I'll only print out those pages that I think I'm going to need. So I end up with my notes, which I skim. I tend not to have to read the entire thing. And my notes are usually only 1 or 2 pages. I try to keep them to 1 page. And then I've got the map of the town that I've annotated that I use while the players are exploring. And then when they go to talk to anybody, I use the key to go look up who that person is in the module. I don't have them all memorized. I don't need to have them all memorized. They're mostly just peasants. What I've done instead is I have notes, which you can read, where I talk about what happens if the players go talk to any normal person. I say, here's what normal townsfolk are like when you meet them. Here's what the cultists are like when you meet them. I have the broad categories worked out so that I can just make exceptions whenever they go and meet a specific person. And I'll do that on the fly. I don't try to figure out every single possible thing the players could do and make a note. What is my plan for dealing with that? Because I think it's impossible to cover every single base. As I read Against the Cult of the Reptile God, I discover some stuff that maybe I don't like or don't agree with. For instance, in one of the houses, there are 2 elves who are like, if this were the Forgotten Realms, they'd be like members of the Harpers. They're 2 good guy elves that are here doing the same thing the players are doing. They're investigating the town, but I don't know. I think that was put in there kind of as a release valve. If the players get lost or if the players don't know what to do, there are these 2 characters in town that can help them, but I don't want to rely on that. I want it to be up to the players to figure out what's going on. And I'm pretty sure as a dungeon master, I can steer them in the right directions. So I cut those 2 elves. I do not use them. Similarly, there's a magic user in who is kind of the Against the Cult of the Reptile God version of Jaru Ashstaff from Village of Hamlet. Maybe we'll do a video prepping that. But he's out. Instead of a druid, he's a magic user, but he's got a grove of stately elms is what it's called in the adventure. And he's basically a druid. And he's a high level. I think he's like 7th level, which in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is quite high level. He's a 7th level magic user that is there to help the players out. And I might keep him or cut him. I don't know, but he's not going to go on the adventure with the heroes. I'm going to portray him, if I use him, as a crotchety old man. He's ill-tempered. He doesn't trust the PCs. He's suspicious of everybody. He's not inclined to help them. Maybe after they've made one foray into the swamp, when they come back, at that point, he trusts them a little bit and maybe he'll help them and give them a scroll or something. He might lend them his familiar whiskers so that they know how to get to the swamp or something like that. But apart from that, he is not someone who is on their side. He's on his side. He's interested in the fate of the town, but he probably doesn't like, adventures. That's one of the themes of the games that I run, is that the heroes are always, this is true, I think it may be even in my notes for this adventure, the heroes are not trusted by the normal townsfolk they meet because normal townsfolk see adventurers as people that bring trouble. And that creates some tension with the heroes. They don't like it. Players don't like when the people they're coming to help are suspicious of them and resentful of them and say, just leave me alone, just go away, you're just going to make things worse. They don't like that, but I have learned that if they persevere and they do good things and they rescue the town, they now the townsfolk love them, they're the heroes of the town, and that feeling of accomplishment, right? They've gone from being suspect, not being trusted, to being beloved and brought into the bosom of the town, makes the players feel like heroes, which is the point of all this. So Raim, the magic user, is an example of that. He is only going to become forthright and trusting of the PCs probably like after they defeat Explicita Defilis, right? After it's too late. Then he will reward them. Or I might cut him entirely because I don't want to confuse the players. I don't want the players to be wondering I don't want them to stop and figure out how can we get this guy on our side. I want them to be trying to solve the problem themselves. There's a bad guy inn filled with the Thieves Guild, which has kind of moved in and taken over. It's called the Golden Grain Inn in Against the Cult of the Reptile God, but I changed it to the Black Frog, and I changed the name of the leader of the Thieves Guild to Dalgleish. Dalgleish is not dominated by Explicita Defilis. They're just here in town taking advantage of what's going on. It's an entire inn run by the Thieves Guild, so if all the heroes come in, Dalgleish, the leader of the Thieves Guild in town, doesn't do anything. The Bertram, the barkeep, will feed them and give them drinks, and they're not poisoned or anything like that, because the Thieves Guild are opportunistic. They don't want a fight that they think they might not win. So if only 1 or 2 heroes come into the bar to investigate, that's when Bertram, at Dalgleish's kind of hill-like nod, Bertram will bring them drinks, after they order, of course, and the drinks will be poisoned with Explicita Defilis' mind control. This is actually kind of similar to Night Below. This is one of the ways that she extends her domination. There's an alliance between Misha, who is in charge of the local church in town and the head of the cult in town, that's in the notes moving forward, and Dalgleish, the head of the Thieves Guild. And Misha gets from Explicita Defilis these potions and gives them to Dalgleish. And that's another way we can, any strangers that come to town and go to the inn, they end up drunk and drugged and taken to the swamp where they meet Explicita Defilis. The adventure talks about how she dominates the heroes, she dominates anybody she grabs, and I like that notion that the heroes might end up split up, that they might have to go rescue rescue one of their buddies, or and this is possible, that someone in the party, because remember, the Thieves Guild only tries to drug the heroes if one or two heroes come in by themselves. The heroes have to go, somebody ends up being mind controlled and comes back to the party, and I have to take that player outside and say, okay, here's what happens. Now you belong to the cult. And of course, I will tell them that the heroes are going to find a way to reverse this. It's not permanent, but I ask the player to play along. And typically what I find is players enjoy that act of playing along. That's not even in my notes, by the way. At that point, we're talking about stuff that probably won't happen until like the second session, because the heroes have to get to Orlane in the first place. And this is where I start working on how to hook the heroes. We did a whole video, which I'll link to in the doobly-doo, where we made a party together on Twitch live for the adventure. And that was back when I thought I was going to be prepping Lost Mine of Phandelver, but I want to play Lost Mine of Phandelver. I don't want to spoil it for myself. So I switched it to Against the Cult of the Reptile God, but you can watch that video. You can read my notes. They're described in my notes. The video is like 2 hours long. So if you don't want to watch 2 hours of us just generating characters, just check out the notes. And in my notes, I list who all the characters are, and I list their gender and race and class and background. Background is super important, I think, for hooking the players. Remember when I said that Against the Cult of the Reptile God had a bad verb, investigate? Well, here's where we're going to fix that, right? We need a better verb. It's okay to tell the players, go figure out what happened. Go figure out what's going on. That's fine as long as there's a person or a thing they can kind of hang their hat on, because then it's not go find out what's going on. It's go find out what happened to, and that person now becomes the subject of our verb. We have 5 characters. Shavar, a female Goliath fighter, and she's a folk hero, and that's super useful to me, right? A folk hero, like a Robin Hood style character. So I decide, in order to hook the players, that there is some other more famous folk hero out there that Shavar knows about, who went to investigate the strange goings-on in Orlane and has not been heard of since. When Shavar's player hears about this, they're going to want to go investigate what happened to this other famous character. I think that's a pretty good hook, and it is revealing, by the way, that I have no idea who that character is. In fact, I might not even know. I might forget to try to figure it out until we're actually playing and I'm talking to Shavar's player. So when she asks, who is this character? I'm going to go, oh, and I have to make somebody up. And notice there's no reference to that anywhere in my notes, no reference to who the character is. So it's probably not going to be somebody in town. It's probably going to be somebody kept in the dungeons. Anybody that resists Explicita Godophilus's domination ends up a prisoner in her dungeon. So that will probably be where this folk hero character is. And it'll be part of the reward for finishing the adventure is rescuing this famous Robin Hood character, which in turn will make Shavar more famous. So it's something I assume based on the fact that this player picked a background that makes them sort of famous. I assume they must want to do things altruistically. They are a folk hero. So if I just say, strange goings on in the town, this other famous Robin Hood character went to investigate and has never been heard of since, at that point, I feel like I've done a pretty good job hooking the player. But maybe not. You never know. So I always have a couple of backups. For instance, we have a Melinda, who is a bard and a spy. And so the spy background says that she has a contact with the local Thieves Guild. And what I'll do is I'll give her a message from her contact saying that a rival Thieves Guild is taking over Orlane. And that is true. I think I call the Thieves Guild the Road, and you can read the message that she gets in the notes that I wrote. And I like that. I like using stuff like the Clock and the Road as names for Thieves Guilds, because then we can talk about them openly in code, right? We can say the road runs through Orlane. And if you are not another thief, you think, well, of course it does. But, that's just normal English. But if you know the code, you realize the Road is the name of the Thieves Guild, and the road runs through Orlane means they're trying to take it over. So if I want to say that the clock, for instance, is active in an area, I'll say the clock is always ticking. But if I want to describe that the clock doesn't really know what's going on in this area, or they're kind of behind, they're like a couple of steps behind the heroes, I'll say the clock is always ticking, but it doesn't always tell the time. We have Quentin Littlebranch, who's a halfling druid and a hermit, and that is useful to us because a big chunk of this adventure, probably realistically the majority of it, takes place in a swamp. There's a dungeon at the bottom of in the swamp, at the bottom of which is Explicita Godophilas. So somebody like Quentin Littlebranch would be aware that there's a problem with the swamp. The swamp is befouled. Although I might not say anything to that player's character until they're near the swamp, because I don't want the players to try to go to the swamp first. I want them to go to Orlane first. So I have a hook for Shavar, the folk hero. There's a more famous famous folk here who's gone missing. I've got a hook for Melinda the spy, right? The Thieves Guild's trying to take over Orlane. And once the players get into the area and start exploring the area, if they head toward the swamp, Quentin Littlebranch will find out that there is a problem with the swamp. I don't need to hook every single player. I mentioned this in my notes. That's up to some of them to figure out why they know each other. You know, again, the players have to meet you halfway. There's also a temple in town. The Temple of Marika is what they call it. I changed it to the Temple of St. Isolde, and it is completely taken over by the cult. The person who used to run it, Abramo, is still there, but now he's dominated by Explicita Defilis, and the new leader is Misha. And Misha is not dominated. She's an evil priestess who is willingly working for Explicita Defilis, and that's important because people who are dominated kind of act sort of out of it, and they don't become a threat until the player characters start asking certain annoying questions. But Misha is not out of it. She is alert and understanding and able to try to fool the players. When the players come up to investigate the church, the temple, the local temple, she is going to rebuff them, right? She's going to say, oh, there are townsfolk here, and they are, but they're cultists. There are townsfolk here, and they're going through Vespers, they're praying, please do not interrupt them. And she's largely going to try and act innocent and act as though the temple is mostly for worshipers. Thanks for visiting. We don't have any problems. If you need any help, let us know. Because again, I don't necessarily want the entire first session to be about raiding this temple. And so far I've run this adventure, I think 3 times, and it never has been. That gives me a week between the players deciding we want to investigate the temple and me having to have it ready, right? There'll be probably a cliffhanger moment where if the players are trying to sneak up to the temple and find out what's going on, I might have troglodytes attack them. Anytime the players talk to the cultists in town, there's a chance they might have an encounter with troglodytes. I mentioned that in the notes, you can read in the doobly-doo, but typically, again, only if one or two characters are knocking at the door of a cultist's house, then that cultist might invite them in, and it turns out there are troglodytes inside, only a couple because it is somebody's house after all, and the troglodytes and these cultists try to ambush the characters. But if there are all 5 characters all walking around together, no one's going to try and mess with them. But after the players have left whatever townsfolk they're talking to, if that townsfolk is a cultist, they're going to go up to the temple and report in, and that lets the players know there's something going on up at the temple. And at that point, I'm done. I've prepped the adventure. I think I have more than enough information to get running. There are maps in the adventure for the inn and for the temple, and if the players go off the rails and investigate something, I can just read what that is in the adventure. If they get farther than I thought they were going to get, I can just read that part and run it. Otherwise, we're not going to start in Orlane. We're probably going to start in Villain, which is my reskinned village of Hamlet, and that's where the players are going to meet. They're going to hear about the rumors that are going to lead them to Orlane, and so they may even get ambushed on the way from Villain to Orlane and fight some troglodytes. And if they do fight some troglodytes, I've made notes. I didn't actually say how many troglodytes because I usually do that on the fly based on, my understanding of how powerful the characters are, which I don't know right now yet. I haven't really gotten into their character sheets yet and know how nasty is this party, but I make a list instead of what types of things they're going to fight. So it's not just going to be trogs. It'll be maybe 3 or 4 troglodytes and 1 guard drake from Volo's Monster Guide, because I like the idea that these troglodytes have pet guard drakes, and a bunch of sturges. Sturges have just figured out, I love sturges. They're my friend Jim Murphy is one of his totem animals for D&D. They're really annoying. Tiny little creatures are really annoying. They're like deadly mosquitoes. The sturges aren't tamed or anything. They've just learned over time that if they hang out with these troglodytes, that they will eat well. I know what kind of bad guy Misha is. I do a little bit of work and figure that out in case they get in a fight with her. I know what kind of bad guy Dalgleish is and what kind of people work for both of them if I need stats for them and abilities, and those are in my notes. I've got maps of everything. I've got the plot. I know who the bad guy is and what she wants. And at that point, I'm ready to run this adventure. Hopefully that was useful to you. It's my goal really not to show you how to do it, only to show you how I do it. And that gives you ideally permission not to do it the way you thought you had to. I thought I had to read the entire adventure and have it all memorized. No, you do not. I don't think there's any virtue in doing it my way, but I do think that there is virtue in figuring out how your way is. I'm pretty active in the comments, especially the day or two after I post a video. That was Prepping an Adventure, folks. On to the contest. We're about to hit 100,000 subscribers. I like doing giveaways just because I like sharing the success of the channel with the people who made it successful. And so the way this contest is going to work is I'm giving away 3 sets of artisan dice, titanium. I think they're called Dragon's Breath dice. They're super cool. I had to use a piece of art because I haven't arrived yet. They're solid titanium, which they then oxidize with flame. I think there's a video on their website where you can watch them doing this. And when titanium oxidizes, it does so with this iridescent sheen that makes the dice just look super cool. So I'm giving away 3 sets of this, and this is how you enter. We're going to use Twitter. You have to go on Twitter. You have to tweet about one of my videos. And I know there are going to be people that complain about that, especially people my age, because people my age are really suspicious of social media, which is whatever with that. I don't like, if you even know who I am, it's because of social media. This is social media. So go on Twitter and tweet about, just pick any video of mine that you thought was interesting. Could be this video, it doesn't have to be, and tweet a link to that video and tag me in your tweet at Matt Colville, MattColville. There's a link to my Twitter handle in the doobly-doo. So link to one of my videos and tag me, and that way I know you did it. I get alerted when you tag me, and that way I know to enter you into the contest. And one last thing, you have to have an actual avatar. You can't just be a faceless nobody. This is just a trivial rejection pass to try to make it a little bit harder for somebody that wants to like enter a whole bunch of times. Obviously, I'm going to do some work behind the scenes to try to make sure that if somebody enters a whole bunch of times that they get disqualified. So I figure asking for a little bit of effort, a little bit of customizability, a little bit of taking Twitter seriously for a second just to enter this contest will help weed out some of the people that want to just exploit the system. So feel free to join Twitter if you're not on there already. Give yourself an avatar, link to one of my videos, and tag me in it. And you're entered in, let's say, 10 days from when I post this video, I will draw 3 winners and we'll do another video. What's that video going to be? I don't know. Either maybe another politics video. We've got a lot more to talk about there. I think we've got maybe 2 more videos in that series. I talked about in the live stream we did, I talked about doing a video on undead, just covering all the different kinds of undead in D&D, because I regularly mistake one type of undead for another. And it's something that bugs the hell out of me, and I figured if I do a video about it, that might finally teach me the difference between like a wraith and a wight and a specter and a ghost and a shadow, which I always get confused. Like, I know the difference between a zombie and a lich, but there's this whole mid-range of undead that I completely forget about and confuse one with the other. Or maybe we'll do another video. It's up to you. I've made a lot of promises in other videos to continue series that I do intend to continue. Like, for instance, we haven't finished even the Getting on the Grid series, because one of the last video in that series I wanted to do was what I know about how to run tactical combat. So let me know in the comments below which video you want to see next. And I am using Twitter for this giveaway. I am super active on Twitter. I don't answer every question. I don't have time to answer every question, but I answer a lot of them. I tend to answer questions that are easy to answer or that I find really intriguing. Otherwise, if I get the same questions over and over again, I'm like, look, those answers are out there. You don't need me to give you the answer. And also, you can come by my subreddit /r/Matt Colville, link in the doobly-doo, and you get there are a lot of really good people on my subreddit that have great answers to people's questions, and occasionally also me. You like how I did that? There are good, smart people on my subreddit, and there's me. As usual, there are no ads in front of my D&D videos. I make no money off of this YouTube channel. If you want to help support the channel, come by my Amazon page. There's a link in the doobly-doo. I am an independent fantasy author. I've written 2 fantasy novels. They're each $5. I raised the price by $1 because I had them professionally edited. They're now a lot punchier and tighter, and the uses of commas and semicolons is a lot more consistent. Check out the reviews on Amazon. Actually, also check out the reviews on Goodreads, because I think the Goodreads reviews are a little more critical. A lot of the Amazon reviews, you can tell, are people that started at my channel, but occasionally you find people in the reviews that have no idea who I am. They just got recommended this book, and those reviews I think tend to be the most useful, but they're all pretty positive. If you like D&D, if you like fantasy, I think you'll like my novels. And of course, I get like $3 or $4 from every sale, and that makes a big difference, frankly. It affords me the ability to buy gear and stuff like that for the channel. And also, like the stream we did, we're going to do another stream, a real D&D stream, a real like campaign, a la Critical Role. We're going to do that for real. And somewhere around September, all that gear for that stream was a result of you folks helping support the channel. So thanks. That's it. Looking forward to giving away the Dragon's Breath dice. See you on Twitter. Until next time, peace out.